Welcome, Privyet. This is Poetry of Immigrants. Gemma Mathewson and Frank Crowley, co-producers of the show. We're growing. Thank you for joining us again. We're going to start off with a poem, as we did last time, from the same fellow, John O'Donohue. Marvelous, marvelous Irish Celtic poet who came to the United States and really had a short life, but he sure produced the poems. This one is called For Citizenship, and we're going to share it. In these times when anger is turned into anxiety and someone has stolen the horizons and mountains,
our small emperors on parade never expect our indifference to disturb their nakedness.
They keep their heads down, and their eyes gleam with reflection from aluminum economic ground.
The media wraps everything in a cellophane of sound, and the ghost surface of the virtual overlays the breathing earth.
The industry of distraction makes us forget that we live in a universe.
We have become the converts to the religion of stress.
Thanks, Gemma.
You're welcome.
And I'll just read a few lines from the poem we opened last week, For an Exile. So this is dedicated to all the immigrants who have come to America seeking freedom of creative expression. When you dream, it is always home. You are there among your own. The rhythm of their voices rising like song, your blood would sing through any dark. Then you awake to find yourself listening to the sounds of traffic in another land. For a moment, your whole body recoils at the strange emptiness of where you are. How soulful and how sensitive to what the true feelings and emotions of immigrants must be, those who write and those who don't. So what is poetry anyway? Well, for me, it's feelings. It's the free expression of feelings. The muse is an intuitive, creative inspiration. And who knows, there's mystery.
For me, it's being brave. It's for letting out what you know is inside you and for taking that leap to be able to share it, to be able to show what you're seeing, what you're feeling, what you've distilled.
And when did you know you were a poet?
Well, when I was a freshman in high school, I was given an assignment in English class. It was a parochial school, and I was told to write a poem about God, which I did. And unbeknownst to me, these poems were sent off to a contest. And I found out months later that I won the Catholic Daughters of America poetry contest. And I felt betrayed.
What a perfect outfit for that.
Because I didn't know this was going to happen to me, and I did it as an assignment. I didn't do it from any real feeling in my heart. It was a forced assignment, and I felt that I had to go through the motions of accepting the award and getting the gold pen, which was stolen from my locker, and
put the grateful face on.
Yeah, put the grateful face on. And it wasn't until about 20 years later that I said, okay, I can write another poem.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a poignant story that is.
And, here I am.
The birth of a poem. Hey, let's read something from Robert Frost about God.
Okay. Robert Frost, Not All There. I turned to speak to God about the world's despair. But to make bad matters worse, I found God wasn't there. God turned to speak to me, don't anybody laugh. God found I wasn't there, at least not over half. And I believe you have a poem, too.
I do. Good old Robert Frost. Langston Hughes, the key player in the Harlem Renaissance, 30s New York. God, I am God, without one friend, alone in my purity, world without end. Below me young lovers tread the sweet ground, but I am God, I cannot come down. Spring, life is love, love is life only. Better to be human than God and lonely. Well, that sets us off to the larger questions of what does the universe have to offer? Let's go back to the 18th century. General George Washington, who wrote a series of wonderful letters. As an intro, I'll give you the famous quote from one of his letters to his nephew. Be courteous to all, but intimate with few, and let those few be well tried before you give them your confidence. True friendship is a plant of slow growth and must undergo and withstand the shocks of adversity before it is entitled to the appellation. I love General George Washington's humility. He is consistent in his humble tone in all these letters, even as the years pass and as he grows in stature and importance. And let's not forget, he refused a third term of office. Some more feelings that he encourages in his nephew. Let your heart feel for the affliction and distresses of everyone, and let your hand give in proportion to your purse, remembering always the estimation of the widow's mite. But that is not everyone who asketh that deserveth charity. All, however, are worthy of the inquiry, or the deserving may suffer. He goes on to echo Polonius, neither a borrower nor a lender be. He's quite an uncle. And I've chosen another letter to get at the universal question, as we started, of what is poetry? What does it do for us? What does it do for the country? This is a little longer, but I'm going to hop, skip, and jump so you'll get the flavor of his estimation of the role of poetry. Mr. Barlow, he's a fellow he sent off to England, the mother country, and to Scotland to say, y'all come. We've got this land west of the Ohio River, and we want to fill it up because we know if we don't, somebody else will claim it. He was so far ahead in his thinking for the well-being of the nation. So off goes Mr. Barlow, his emissary. And Washington says, this guy is a poet, Mr. Barlow. He's a genius of the first magnitude. And to be one of those bards who hold the keys of the gate by which patriots, sages, and heroes are admitted to immortality. Wow, that's high stakes indeed. To have your name writ large in the book of immortality takes a poet, such as your ancient bards who are both the priest and the doorkeepers to the temple of fame. Yeah, not your 15 minutes of fame. No. I know. Men of real talents in arms have commonly approved themselves patrons of the liberal arts and friends to the poets of their own as well as former times. In some instances, by acting reciprocally, heroes have made poets and poets heroes. Alexander the Great is said to have, and so on, down through the ages. And he says, I observe that the critics in England who speak highly of the American poetical geniuses, well, like Phyllis Wheatley, to whom he wrote, and which we read in the last show, and their praises may be the more relied upon as they seem to be reluctantly extorted, little jealousy on the part of the English, are not pleased with the tribute of applause which is paid to your nation. He's talking about France now. This is a letter to the Marquis de Lafayette, May 28, 1788. Wow, that's a year before Le Déluge, the French Revolution. It is a reason why they should be more caressed by your nation. So in General George Washington's estimation, poets make the hero.
He talked about the great power that poets have. The poets also have the power of conscience, of being the conscience of the people.
And I think of those lines, give me your tired and your poor, which probably was General Washington's sentiment. So who have you brought today?
Well, I am representing by my costume Emma Lazarus, who was born a New Yorker in 1849. She was born to Jewish parents who had lived here. Her mother's family was here pre-revolution in New York. And she was approximately the middle child of 7. And she was very connected to her Jewish faith and became connected to the immigrants from who were fleeing the Russian pogroms of Jews in I think 1870s, 1880s, I believe.
What a dicey time.
Yeah. And she started a school for Jewish women, a vocational school, to help them as they were coming into this country. And so she became known for her poetry. And she was, at the time the Statue of Liberty was given to the United States, she was asked to write a poem to help raise money for the pedestal.
Wow.
Now the statue was coming here, but there was no money for the pedestal. So people in New York and elsewhere were trying to raise money for the statue, and she, like my story, she resented the fact that she was asked to write this poem to order, and but she thought, well, for the statue, I'll do it anyway. And she wrote a poem that is still one of our core American poems that speaks to the heart of what our country is in immigration today.
And comes from our hearts.
And comes from our hearts. I will read the poem, which is a sonnet, in just a minute, but I wanted to say that the title of the poem is The New Colossus, and the Colossus that she's referring to from Greek fame is the Colossus of Rhodes, which was in the 1st century BC, installed in Rhodes, and it was depicted in the Middle Ages and later as having its feet astride the 2 points of the bay. But in fact, going back to the ancient writings, it was never described that way. So it was a fanciful depiction that caught on and became a meme of how this statue looked. But it was not astride anything. It did, however, have a torch. And it was, however, before it was toppled in an earthquake about 80 years later. This statue, the Colossus of Rhodes, did have a torch, and it was about the same size as the Statue of Liberty. So that is what she is referring to here. And the poem is called The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beaconed hand glows world-wide welcome, and her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she, with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
Eternal.
Eternal. And it's just, it's often quoted now because of the description that she has of the refugees.
Yes.
And I think it still stands as an important poem in our time.
It's really a kind of pillar of our moral structure in this country. Mm-hmm. And alive today, we have so many immigrants now knocking at our door, and the words stand in good stead.
They do. And the language that she uses is so, it's visceral.
It's visceral.
The worldwide welcome and imprisoned lightning, that is
the power
right.
of the feelings struggling to break free of a sonnet. How beautiful that she was able to craft a sonnet. And I noticed as you read so well that there are tongue twisters in this poem, which means musicality.
It is very musical.
She has such a wonderful,
the tempest-tossed and teeming shore, yeah.
So much alliteration, so much almost onomatopoeia. But what power each line packs. That's another definition of really effective and high-quality poetry.
And the irony is that she resented having to have a made-to-order poem, and yet she rose to the occasion because she felt it was a worthy cause. And the pedestal, the money for the pedestal was raised, and the granite comes from Stony Creek, from the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. So
It's
right
nice
here in our neighborhood.
It's really nice to know that, that Brantford in Connecticut is sort of packed into the foundation.
Right.
One of the original colonies, too. I love that poem. I always think about it, but now I think about it in a different context, that this is a result also of the pogroms in Russia, where so much repression and vitriolic punishment that was based in anti-Semitism forced these people out of their homes, as we talked about earlier, and across the briny deep. Phyllis Wheatley did it, so many others after her, but they had to in Russia. 1886 and on was such a vicious time to be in Russia and Jewish. And
I don't know if I mentioned this to you before, but the Lower East Side Tenement Museum has a wonderful experience where you can go and get a tour of different people, the immigrants at different stages that lived in this actual tenement building.
I heard about that.
In the 1880s, it was the Jewish family. I think in the 1900s, it was the Irish family, and the 1920s, the Italian family. And you can tour each of these three apartment buildings and hear the stories of actual families who lived there and what they had to do. They had outhouses at first. They had to carry in their water, and when they did it, they shared sometimes with families of 10 and 12 these 3-room railroad flats.
Yes.
And how they survived and how they lived. And
I have seen visuals, and they're very, very moving, but I would give my eye teeth to remember to go to the East Side Museum next time. The East Side became a kind of cradle of American culture, too. in a wonderful way because it was the proverbial melting pot. And you could see those nationalities getting stirred together. Wonderful poem. Thank goodness for Emma Lazarus. Did she write anything else?
She did. And I don't have anything else with me today, but she was a poetess, and her some of the criticism that she got was being too emotional.
Oh.
Which things as that nature go in and out of style, as does, lyric poetry and
as do sonnets.
Sonnets.
Yeah.
Form poetry, and it all has its
vogue.
Yeah, and cycles.
Yes, cycles for sure.
If you'd like, I could read a more contemporary poem about the struggles of immigrants.
I'd like. Let's set that up. So, from 1886, the floodgates were open. Mm-hmm. Ellis Island, became the receptacle and then disgorged all these processed immigrants from all over the world. But then the dominant culture of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture of the 20s took alarm, took notice, but even before that. And they started to clamp down on Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. So there are various cultural waves, too, that were allowed to come into the country based on political expediency. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So by this time, 20s, 30s, 40s, it was narrowed down from a flood to more of a trickle from certain areas of Europe and ethnicities. And then I guess that accordion through the last 100 years has gone back and forth. And now we're up to Syrian immigrants who are coming in. And you're volunteering to help. Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful thing. I'd love to hear a more modern poem.
Well, this poem is by Christy Nami Erickson, who lives in Anchorage, Alaska. She is a Korean adoptee, and her overview is about, it's a historical overview of immigration throughout the United States at different times. And I think it's something that's very timely, and she is a spoken word poet, so she performs this poem, and you get a different sense of the flow of this poem from the sonnet.
It's
before.
different energy
right,
and different
it is.
Rhythm when you're spoken word poetry.
Mm-hmm. What does an illegal immigrant look like? An illegal immigrant looks like a nickel tails up on the sidewalk, fallen out of someone's pocket. She looks like pressed bleach sheets on cheap beds tucked tight, 100 of them, 12 stories high. I saw one like a mango peeled and sprinkled with chili powder on a stick like America, layers cut diagonally, a flower on Lake Street. She looks like an amethyst grape plucked by the millions, stains like bruises, but she's sorry and she loves you. She looks like that kid. I don't know his name, but he sits over there and his lunch stinks. An illegal immigrant looks like Chinese exclusion, 1882, Asian exclusion, 1924, Executive Order, 1966, Patriot Act, 2001, SB 1070, 5 days ago, 1911, looks like an angel made of bunk beds and cells, where Chinese men write poems into the wooden wall like it could weather the weight. Looks like a store sign in 1922. Absolutely no dogs or Filipinos allowed. Like 1942 Spam, rolled up like an enemy internment camp sushi. He is a community tree in the 1930s or the 1940s or the 1960s who has seen too many dead people to climb on.
Wow.
He is a boat in 1492 sailing the ocean blue, black, brown, yellow, red. He looks like a hill made of bodies covered in grass and a playground like a scar on the bottom of my feet, still growing. He looks like Joseph E. Leto, who looks like Vincent Chin, who looks like Fong Li, who looks like your neighborhood postman, who looks like a good husband, like a boy on a maddening, threatening, 5-deviled bicycle. Looks like a good target, looks like a bad seed, looks like the wrong crowd, looks like a Jap mother who stole our jobs. So one by one, by 100, they kill them innocently. Because if you look like the law, you look legal. And the rest of us are just wire cages and a magic trick away from knowing whose turn it is to be a sacrificial pigeon. And it's showtime, all the time.
Oh, that moves me almost as much as Emma Lazarus's poem. And it brought tears to my eyes, and I really hadn't read it or heard it before. And it certainly covered 100 years. Mm-hmm. And back to 1492. Oh, what a gift that poem is. And how topical, contemporary, as you say, 5 days ago. Where does that leave us? I think it leaves us pondering the true values of what America originally was founded on, going back to Washington. And turns out that he kept ringing the bell of freedom, and then it was echoed up through the presidents in line. And now I'm reading Truman by David McCullough, and I'm seeing the same sort of resurgence of love for original values. Mm-hmm. And this is a good place for a break.
Okay.
We are neighbors and best friends.
I love my sister.
My heart doesn't see race. Love is love.
Our family is no less than any other family.
Yagoya, Yagoria, Yagorla, Yagolas. Those are
nothing. There's
4 intro lines to stanzas by Andrei Voznesensky. And he was the big poet of the 60s. And he really conformed to what the Soviets wanted in the 60s. They had a slight thaw. The 60s is known after Khrushchev's fall as a kind of thaw, otyepil, which allowed creative artists in Russia to have limited freedom. But they got a taste of it. So Yevtushenko came along, and the two of them were born in 1933. And by the 60s, 1960s, they were in full flower. They came to the UN. I missed that reading. Oh, I could have died. I was studying Russian in the 60s. And I thought, wow, Voznesensky really played with perfect musicality. Now you see, that's not how the poem reads in English, because the translator's art is only good enough to sometimes craft in English what the original poem in Russia conveys, but not what it sounds like. So I wanted to give you a little of the repetition of sound. Ya Gloria, I am envy. Ya Golodin, I'm hungry. Ya Golis, I am the gullet. What a wonderful play with sound. Can't do that in English, in translation. So the joys of original poetry and its original cultural, ethnic sound can't be translated. And the translator's art is so daunting that many translators give up. But another fellow, a little later, Brodsky, Joseph Brodsky, born in 1940 in Leningrad, really became a thorn for the authorities in the 70s. See, by then, the 70s, repression came back in. The thaw was over. Voznesensky and Yevtushenko had had their day. And the new one, the new kid on the block, brilliant in the tradition of Pasternak and Anna Akhmatova, who was his muse, said, I can't live here and be creatively free. I'm not a political poet, but I have to express myself freely. So 1940, 1965, 25, what was it you read?
I read that he was sent to a work camp.
Yeah, Siberia.
Yeah, in Siberia. And
oh my gosh.
Yeah. And they called him it wasn't a social parasite, it was something along those lines.
Oh yeah, social.
Oh, yeah, for social parasitism.
Yeah.
That's what that's what he was interred for. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that because it was so hard to find a place to be quiet and live by yourself, he actually didn't mind as much being in this Arctic environment in a little cabin, because to him it was a release where he could write. Although I'm sure he suffered from the elements and so on.
Yeah, he had to do a certain hard labor
Right.
to survive and get food. What a brutal existence, and yet what do poets incarcerated and under pressure from, hey, go back to Edward I in England, throwing the Welsh bards off the cliff because they represented freedom. What do? Well, as you read earlier, Japanese poets writing on walls in their confinement. Thank God he had pen and paper. So Brodsky ran afoul, but in a big way. The international community was outraged. All the artists wrote to the Soviet authorities in 72 and 75 and said, no, you can't treat this man to 5 years of hard labor because he's a creative artist. They backed off. They commuted the sentence to 18 months. He came back. He was fully himself again in verse. They said, we're driving you to the airport this morning and you're out of here. So that was 72. So a little stay in Austria, France, and then of course the United States took him. Thank God. And he learned English.
To translate John Donne. He loved the poetry
Simply
of
to
John
translate John Donne. He had a flair for languages, obviously, but to love John Donne enough to learn another language. He learned Polish, too, for Czesław Miłosz. He wanted to read his poetry. My goodness, Taught himself. I didn't teach myself Russian, believe me. And there he was at the doorstep. Give me, you're tired, you're poor, you are oppressed. You're yearning to be creatively free. We took him in. And he gets the Nobel Prize in '87. Maybe that was a tweak by the Swedish Nobel Committee to the Soviet authorities by '87, when things started to fall apart anyway. But he was still first rate.
Interesting theory.
I wouldn't want to take that away from him.
Right.
Right. But being cognizant of all the movements internationally, sure, he won it in his own right, but it was a perfect time to set the Soviet authorities back. So then, 90 came, the end of the Soviet Union in 91, Berlin Wall came down. But poor Joseph sat by the window, back in prison. I sit by the window. I said fate plays a game without a score. And who needs fish if you've got caviar? The triumph of the Gothic style would come to pass and turn you on. No need for coke or grass. I sit by the window, outside an aspen. When I loved deeply. It wasn't often. I said the forest's only part of a tree. Who needs the whole girl if you've got the knee? Sick of the dust raised by the modern era, the Russian eye would rest on an Estonian spire. I sit by the window, the dishes are done. I was happy here, but I won't be again. I wrote, the bulb looks at the floor in fear. I take it as the light bulb. And love as an act lacks a verb. The zero Euclid thought the vanishing point became wasn't math. It was the nothingness of time. I sit by the window, and while I sit, my mouth comes back. Sometimes I'd smile or spit. I said that the leaf may destroy the bud. What's a fertile falls in fallow soil? A dud. That on the flat field, the unshadowed plain, nature spills the seed of trees in vain. I sit by the window, hands lock my knees. My heavy shadows, my squat company. My song was out of tune, my voice was cracked, but at least no chorus can ever sing it back. That talk, like this, reaps no reward, bewilders no one. No one's legs rest on my shoulders. I sit by the window in the dark, like an express, the waves behind the wavelength curtain crash. A loyal subject of these second-rate years, I proudly admit that my finest ideas are second-rate. And may the future take them as trophies of my struggle against suffocation. I sit in the dark. And it would be hard to figure out which is worse, the dark inside or the darkness out. Now, if that isn't an emigre about to be born, let me out of here. My soul is bursting. And thank God we took him in. Would you mind? The second one is October Time. It's a very short, simple poem.
Okay. October Tune. A stuffed quail on the mantelpiece minds its tail. The regular chirp of the old clock's healing in the twilight, the rumpled helix. Through the window, birch candles fail. For the fourth day, the sea hits the dike with its hard horizon. Put aside the book. Take your sewing kit. Patch my clothes without turning the light on. Golden hair keeps the corner lit.
Wonderful. That sounds so claustrophobic, which is what the scene of Leningrad really is. It's bordered by water on three sides. And Peter the Great's Folly, they called it, the Venice of the North. But it was also like a prison house, and certainly literally with the Nazi siege of 900 days became one. But I feel the claustrophobic tone.
And the increasing darkness.
Yeah.
Even when he sat by the window and he sat by the window and he sat by the window, and it ended with darkness outside and then inside. And this one, it's everything is, the candles are failing, the twilight, and the only thing is the hair, blonde hair is at the end.
Just a little
Yeah, a little
strand
glint,
of hope
right,
left.
Strand of hope.
And he's sewing in the dark. Of course, he's mending his clothes because he's so poor. Give me, you're tired, you're poor, you're yearning to be creatively free. Wow, Joseph Brodsky, who knew, became one of the lights. He wrote in English after a while, and then, of course, the beauty of it is he translated his own Russian poems into English. What's better than that? I guess that's the best scene.
That's the best scenario that
I
you
would
could
think
ask
so.
about, yeah.
And he was, of course, a musical poet, so he's preserving the musicality of the poem at the same time. Now, the one I read earlier, the window poem, brought back frost for me. Tree at my window, window tree. That's frost, and he's projecting feelings on the tree outside the window. And it's in the same kind of depressive stance which Frost suffered from. Isn't that interesting how those echoes can really connect poets emotionally? As I say, that poem, I Sit by the Window, which had a kind of rhyme to it. You heard the music, right? Aspen often, done again, sit, spit. The translator was Howard Moss. So that's an earlier poem when Brodsky was still in confinement, and that goes back to the late 60s. And it's interesting that the translator decided to frame it in a more formal way by giving it the rhythm and the rhyme of a formal poem. Stanzas and rhyming couplets at the end. And that takes a real talent in itself. The translator has to keep the essential meaning and theme and can change the diction, but to work that into musical magic as a translator, I thought was quite an achievement. And he didn't have the advantage of speaking Russian as well as Brodsky did. Howard Moss is not a Russian. Fascinating.
Yeah, it is fascinating.
So there's three people here. There's the translator, there's the poet, there's the audience. Wonderful. How I love Russian poetry for its sound. Some of the intro on Russian poetry is good to quote. I will just give about 2 minutes of what the poetry evokes from the critic. Joseph Brodsky, exiled poet who won Nobel, dies at age 55. The poetry of Joseph Brodsky, with its haunting images of wandering and loss and the human search for freedom, was not political, and certainly not the work of an anarchist or even the active dissident. If anything, his was a descent of the spirit, like all true poets, protesting the drabness of life in the Soviet Union and its pervasive materialist dogmas. So the poet, almost by nature, representing his culture and language, her culture, says, I don't subscribe to materialism. My universe is a moral construct, and that's the gift of true poetry, to remind us of our moral underpinnings. But in a land of poets where poetry and other literature was officially subservient to the state, where verses were marshaled like so many laborers to the quarries of socialist realism, it was perhaps inevitable that Mr. Brodsky's work, unpublished except in underground forums, samizdat, self-published, but increasingly popular, should have run afoul of the literary police. So the contrast,
So
the
he survived. He
work,
survived in the underground.
he survived in the underground and thrived later.
Thrived.
So not only is the contrast between materialist philosophy and a moral structure assumed to nations, it's that, he touched the nerve of saying no. He was also Jewish and had that background folded into his words. But he's also saying, no, the state exists for the individual, as in America. Not as in the Soviet Union, the individual exists for the good of the state.
And the conflict goes on.
It goes on. And yesterday and today, it's a hot topic. Wow. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I felt so good to talk about Brodsky as a hero.
Would you like me to read one more poem about immigrant?
I'd love it.
Okay, this one is by Laurie Guerrero. She is the Poet Laureate of San Antonio and the state of, in 2014, and the state of Texas in 2016. This is a more personal poem about an immigrant experience. The other one was an overview.
Yeah.
This one is a specific memory that she has. Brownies of the Southwest, Troop 704. 3 years before I hear the word beaner from white boys who first spit in my broccoli and then in my hair, my mother dressed me each Wednesday in that brown sheath. I was 7. It was the only time I'd ever wear a sash. Miss America, she said. 20 Miss Americas. We made kitsch from clothespins and pipe cleaners, and our brown socks were banded and complicated with orange tassels just below the brown rosettes of our knees, little skulls knocking together in our elementary school cafeteria. How we jumped the day we heard voices raising there instead of at home when Tracy's mom slapped our troop leader, and Tracy cried. And Tracy's mom was white, and only her dad was brown, and Tracy was a little bit prettier than the rest of us. At our lunch tables, white bitch stuck to our fingers like glue, and ugly Mexicans landed like glitter onto the sashes laid across our small hearts. With Tracy, we watched manifest between us a line risen from the tiled floor where we shared meals as tears clung to the eye rims of my 7-year-old compañeras. Lorena chewed her fingernails till blood bloomed on her ring finger. Andrea peed quietly on her brown knee socks. Neither of us knew where to hide. This was not home, where we could run to the broom closet or to the feet of our big brothers.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So
That is so touching and
it
personal.
is touching. It is touching, and it's about the need to feel part of the bigger group and yet feeling that you're part of your own group, and where do you fit in? And I'm sure that every girl there was as beautiful as every other little girl, but everybody thinks that the ideal is something, that's held up to them from somewhere else, and it's heartbreaking.
It's heartbreaking, and what a struggle to grow up in that kind of conflict, internal and external. What a wonderful poem to feel. I love the way you read because you have such passion in your voice, communicating the deeper feelings in each of the poems. Lyric poetry is what? Well, it's song of the heart, It's not an epic poem like the Greeks. It's just a strum of the lyre, and then the heart opens up and pours out. That's what lyric poetry is. That's what we've been doing all day. Let's do a quick ending with Claude Mackay, Jamaican poet.
Okay. This poem is called Heritage. Now the dead past seems vividly alive, and in this shining moment I can trace down through the vista of the vanished years your fawn-like form, your fond, elusive face.
And suddenly comes secret springs released, and unawares a riddle is revealed, and I can read like large black lettered print what seems before a thing forever sealed.
I know the magic word, the graceful thought, the song that fills me in my lucid hours, and the spirit's wine that thrills my body through and makes me music drunk are yours, all yours.
I cannot praise, for you have passed from praise. I have no tinted thoughts to paint you true, but I can feel and I can write the word. The best of me is but the least of you. Back to humility and George Washington. Thank you so much, Emma Lazarus.
Thank you so much, George Washington.
What a good time. I guess we communicate today how passionate we are about poetry, but really what poetry is for culture. Thank you so much. Had a great time. And some last thoughts on how you feel about an hour show.
I feel that this works.
This works.
I'm happy to continue in whatever way you would like to go forward.
We're making lightning strides. Yeah, that lightning, as Emma says. Are you still out there, audience? Are you with us? Because we gave you our hearts today, and I'm really glad you tuned in. So next month is National Poetry Month. We'll be here with a brand new show and hopefully a third guest and some Chicano and Chicana writing too. So we're going to cover the universe. What fun this was. That's like the sandbox, right?
Oh, sandbox and Play-Doh.
And Play-Doh all together, yeah. Would that the kids would watch us instead of there. Just an editorial comment. So, we have 1 minute, and I'd like to say, I'm 75. I've never felt more passionate about poetry, that I can feel passion at 75, that I can share the joy of poetry. And you're going tonight to your Poetry Institute in New Haven.
Right.
And there'll be open mic, and people will flock there. 847 Chapel Street.
Right. It's
Ring the bell.
It's Poetry Institute at the Institute Library.
The Institute Library.
On Chapel Street, a half a block south of the Green.
Perfect.
And everyone's welcome to bring a poem and read a poem, and we have a featured reader every month. So please come by.
It's more fun.
My co-host Mark McGuire Schwartz and I would love to have you.
Because when you see the library, 1830, first private library established in the country for working people.
Right. Journeyman, 8 journeymen established that library. Yeah.
And you'll smell the books. It's a wrap.
It is.
Thank you so much. What a good time. And thanks to Al, our sound man, and to Ken.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Al and Ken.
Yeah. And of course to Chris.
And Chris. He always seems to get the mics.
Everybody go to Yum, let them just survive.